spent 15 years in Microsoft, bouncing between IC and manager, then left Microsoft for a startup, spent 3.5 years at Adobe, and then joined IMDb, which is an Amazon company.
I've actually been in 11 different startup companies and two larger ones. So I've done operations, I've done engineering, leadership, and management.
So we'll ask you for your most impactful story when you volunteer. Observe the star format as we discussed, right? If we detect meandering situation or task responses.
Thank you for joining on Saturday, new mock interview session. Today we have Eugene Polonsky and Ken Furry. Both are in engineering leadership and in the leadership in general. Eugene have been already a guest in our previous session, so thank you for doing it. And Ken is a first-time guest. Ken, thank you for coming. Tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you've been over 25 plus years in leadership positions in the startups. Maybe briefly about your background.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Yeah, I think I make a reasonable counterpoint to Eugene, who's had this brilliant career at these companies whose names you recognize without having to try. I've actually been in 11 different startup companies and two larger ones, which I don't really mention, and had to work to get jobs in every single one of them and had to fight my way up the ranks. As such, I've done many things. You often will wear multiple hats in the startup. So I've done operations, I've done engineering, leadership, and management. Probably the most common thing I've done is product leadership. But instead of being a jack of all trades, I've really dug in and got to expert level as well as I was able to in all those disciplines. And now I have all this wealth of experience that nobody's much interested in. They just want to know if I can manage this product, which is pretty funny. I'm here to offer a perspective on anybody who's not excited about working at Microsoft, for example.
Exactly. Awesome. Thank you, Ken, for introduction. Eugene, welcome back. For those people who don't know you, maybe a few words about your background.
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here again. Great to see for anybody who's returning. Great to see you guys again. Briefly, my background, I actually started my career in startups back in like late 90s, early 2000s. And then in 2003, I got hired by Microsoft, spent 15 years in Microsoft, bouncing between IC and manager, then left Microsoft for a startup. Pretty quickly decided that startups are not my game. Went over to Adobe, spent 3.5 years at Adobe, and then joined IMDb, which is an Amazon company, which is where I am now. In my career, I've bounced between IC and manager several times, I think about 4 or 5 times. So I have a really good sense of what that transition looks like. And obviously, even when I was inside Microsoft, I changed my teams 6 times. So I have quite a bit of experience interviewing in various teams in Microsoft as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So today we have basically in our session, we divide it in 2 parts. The first part, Eugene and Ken will have a talk about passing the engineering manager interview. And the second half, we're going to do the mock interviews for leadership positions. And actually, if you are not in a leadership position, but you want to do the mock interview, let us know. So whoever wants to participate today, just hit the plus sign in our chat so I will know the order who will be the first come, first serve. Yeah, and that would be about it. We'll try to make it about in 1 hour and we'll have another 15, 20 minutes for questions and answers. So let's get started. Eugene, I'm passing over to you.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if you guys can see this.
Looks good.
Awesome. So I threw together a quick presentation to talk about the main points of engineering, passing the engineering manager interview. Ken, as you hear things and you want to chime in, feel free to chime in at any time. We'll make this a collaborative session. And if anybody have questions, just ping in the chat. Evgeny, if you can interrupt me and then we can stop and answer some questions and then keep going. It's not a very long day. So
my first interjection is we can see reminders for the mock interview in the dry run. So you can dismiss those.
That's true.
Oh, it's interesting. It's not sharing. Okay. Can you guys see now?
Yes, we're good.
Awesome. Okay, so first question is, when interviewing for a engineering manager, what kind of areas are likely to be covered? And I think probably some of you have already experienced this if you've interviewed for an EM role before, but just really quick, like the major points that you want to convey. Obviously technical, right? That doesn't need to be said. It's mostly going to be focused on system design, although I will say that I have been asked coding questions as an engineering manager in Microsoft. So that can happen. I consider it to be an aberration, and personally, I consider it to be a red flag. An engineering manager shouldn't be expected to code. Sometimes that does happen. The biggest thing, or the biggest two things that I would say that you want to show as an engineering manager in an interview is ownership, right? How do you take a business problem and own it and drive it all the way to conclusion? And customer obsession, right? How much are you focused on customer needs? How do you adapt your engineering process and like the output of your team towards customer needs? How do you work with PMs, product, marketing, sales, stakeholders to make sure that the product that's being developed is adapted towards customer needs? Those two things play really highly in whatever conversation or whatever stories you wind up telling about your previous time. And then, of course, there are a bunch of others that are always probed in, right? Like dealing with ambiguity, right? Like how are you able to take big ambiguous problems and drive them to a solution? Dealing with conflict, right? The higher up, as you've seen, the higher up you go on the leadership ladder, the more diverse personalities and the more ambiguous conflict you will tend to encounter. So how do you deal with that? How do you approach performance management on your team? So dealing with underperformers, dealing with star performers, how do you encourage people to grow, all that kind of stuff. How do you approach hiring and diversity? So obviously, how do you evaluate candidates? How do you make sure that your candidate pipeline is diverse? Diversity, like D&I, as you guys know, has become really important, and it should be. So you should have really good thoughts about and good examples from your previous history on how you've approached that. And finally, efficient execution, right? So how do you structure the process of your team? How do you make sure that your team is executing as efficiently as possible? How do you deal with inefficiencies? How do you resolve bottlenecks? Like one of the common ways of thinking about engineering managers is as a third umbrella. So how do you function as a third umbrella for your team to make sure that your team is executing efficiently and not getting distracted by things that are happening outside of it? So
Like
those
raining from the sky.
Sorry?
Like turds raining from the sky. I like that image.
Exactly.
Very nice. Yeah,
Exactly.
I have something to input once you've had your say.
Yep. Yeah. So basically, those are the ones that I could think of. But Ken, go ahead and jump in.
You'll all notice I'll be focusing a little bit more on the softer side of things. And with engineering management interviews, you're also being evaluated on your presence. How precise is your thinking? How articulate are you in your ability to express these areas of expertise? If you have a longer story and you're winding around and you're talking about every detail, that actually is probably a red flag to somebody. That's how you're going to be when you're presenting your team's results to leadership. So you also have to be very pointed. And in these following slides, Eugene has gone out of his way to talk about how to bias towards certain types of optimizations. That's super important stuff because that actually will make the best impression on the person, regardless of what it is you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And the thing that I, as a hiring manager, and I'm sure anybody who's interviewed before have encountered this, when a candidate is telling us a story about their past, it's like being plunged into an icy pool all the way up above your head, right? Because there's so much context and there is so much information that we are not experienced with and we don't know. And we need to be able to filter through that information in real time to figure out what it is the candidate is saying. If you guys have ever tried writing notes after an interview and distilling what the candidate said into 2, 3, 4 sentences to be able to relate what the interview was about, you will know what I'm talking about. Like trying to distill a 5-minute ramble about context into 2, 3 sentences is like pulling nails, right? And chances are what's going to happen in those situations when people are not concise and not exact in how they articulate their context, that context will be misunderstood. And if the context is misunderstood, then the subsequent action that the candidate talks about is likely to get misunderstood as well, right? So you want to be really super crisp and keep only the most relevant details when you're talking about context to make that context as easily understandable as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Okay, so main interview approach. So we're going to, for the purposes of this discussion, we are going to leave technical aside. So we're not going to talk about system design or coding. Anybody who's gotten to an engineering manager role knows how to pass those kind of interviews and has resources to be able to ramp up on those. So we are going to focus on the stuff that is not as well covered in interview prep books or literature, which is more soft skills. And the most important part of those soft skills is going to be your story bank. And I've actually seen in Amazon candidates show up with a printed out sheet of paper that lists their stories. And when they're asked the question, they actually go to that sheet of paper and they find the story that best suits the question and then they start talking about it. And there's no problem with that whatsoever. In fact, like it tends to be a green flag when we see that, hey, the candidate really thought about their past experience, they've organized it, and they're trying to find the best story that fits. So don't be afraid to have that kind of a cheat sheet with you. Obviously, don't read off the sheet when you're getting the answers. Like that hopefully doesn't need to be said, but having a cheat sheet like that is super helpful. So what you want to do essentially is create a library of stories. And I'll talk about where to get these stories on the next slide. But essentially, once you have a library of like 10 to 15 stories that you feel most represent your work, map each of these stories to the set of the areas in the previous slide that story covers, right? For example, you might have a story that really shows ownership and like performance management. So maybe like you had an IC on the story who was struggling and you stepped in to help and you managed to help them grow. And at the same time, you were able to deliver the story, etc. So most projects at an EM level that span more than a few days are going to involve several areas, which means that whenever you're asked a question on one of those areas, like you will have a couple stories to choose from, right? That you can talk to. You should know what those stories are ahead of time. So, if I'm asked about ownership, I'm going to talk about this one or this one, right? If I'm asked about efficiency, I'm going to talk about that one or that one. So hopefully that makes sense. Obviously, the more senior a role you're interviewing for, so like frontline engineering manager, senior engineering manager, director, the larger scope those stories should be, right? As a director, you probably don't want to talk about that 2-day task that you oversaw, right? That's not going to be super interesting. And then obviously for any story that you're going to tell, be ready for dig deep questions, right? So be ready for follow-ups and you should know the story exhaustively. The worst thing that can happen is somebody asks you a question about a story and you can't remember the answer. You really want to avoid that. Anything on this slide you want to add, Ken?
Brief mention of the star format. I remember when I first saw a note about that, and I'm like, great, now there's something else I have to remember, which is a big deal when you've been around as long as I have. But the star format is basically just a sensible approach to how to unwind your experience. So take a quick look at it and get to understand it. But it actually is, it's very sensible. It's not something you'll have to memorize so long as you stick to that kind of pattern as you reply to questions.
Awesome. So the next logical question you might ask is, where do I get these 10 to 15 stories from? And there are two big buckets that I tend to draw mine from. One is, look at my last performance review. What did I put into that performance review as things that I did that I was proud of, right? What did my manager put into that performance review? What are the things that went well? Even what are the things that didn't go as well? Because there are some stories, for example, tell me about a time that you made a mistake that caused some business impact, right? That actually look for negative stories. And negative stories can be fine as long as as long as hopefully they're not super recent. Like the best negative story is going to be early on in my career, I did blah, blah, blah. And second, that you have really good learnings from it and that you can show that you've applied those learnings. Here's the thing that happened. I messed up. Here's what I learned from it. Here's a new situation that arose where I applied those learnings. That's a perfectly fine negative story to tell. That's the first bucket. Think to your last performance review or generally your performance reviews. And the other one is, if you think about your past 3 years, just enumerate any multi-week projects you had, any projects where things went wrong and potentially you had to step in, any projects that involved multiple teams and you had to coordinate between multiple teams and get them all aligned, any projects where you were a key contributor, right? Any projects that you're particularly proud of, or that had a large impact to the company's revenue bottom line. And then finally, any projects that you initiated yourself proactively or that were based on your ideas, right? So those tend to be like fertile fields for finding good stories. Ideally, if you've been in the industry, if you're an engineering manager, you definitely should have anywhere between 10 to 20 stories that you can tell. And you've been working for more than a year. They may not all be super large scope, but you should have that 10 to 20 stories.
I'll just throw in a little color on the, tell me about something that you did wrong or a mistake you made. That's super important because my management philosophy, and I'm encountering this everywhere, is that mistakes are actually welcome. It's something you don't have to do again. It's only the repeating of the mistake or the failure to learn from it that really is the problem. It's okay to go ahead and confess up that early on in your career, you really blew it big time and it was an impact. But what did you do from there is actually the best way to wind up that story. I'd also say that for the past 3 years, that really is that's the time you should focus on for all the positive stories. Don't propose to talk about things that are deeper into your career. I've done that many times. And the question was, all right, that's fine, but what have you been up to lately? And so I've just wasted somebody's time in the interview by spending time extolling things that occurred in the past. And have some real details about this. You should actually understand if you had some large scale bottom line impact, right? You raised ARR by $22 million. Be able to say that out loud. Include that kind of thinking in your responses. What was that impact and how do you know? And those will be questions that you get and will actually stand in your favor if you can answer them very cleanly and easily.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing I will say, actually, reminded me, Ken, on things going wrong, that's worth thinking about. A very common tendency that I've seen in candidates when asked this question is to think of something small. For example, I'll ask, what is the mistake you made that caused a tangible business impact? And they'll say, I broke this build once. Okay, how long did it take to fix? Oh, it was like half an hour. This guy came in and fixed it and it was fine. And I'm going like, why are you telling me this? Like, and I think it's a human attempt to try to minimize the severity of the mistake and to try to indicate that, like, okay, I have to answer the question about things going wrong, but I don't want to give you anything big because you're going to think badly of me. But the thing is, the most important purpose that question serves is as a level setter. So if the biggest mistake you ever made is to break a build for half an hour, you must not have had a large scope of work, right? You must have had a junior role. And so don't be afraid to talk about big ticket mistakes. If you're ever in doubt, remember that the head of Xbox, back in Xbox One days, let through a bug that caused $1 billion of revenue loss to Microsoft. He was then transferred to the head of HoloLens, right? Which is still a very prestigious position. So mistakes are not what kills you, right? Mistakes are not what torpedoes your career or that will cause a rejection in an interview. It's how you learn from those mistakes and how you avoid repeating them. That's really important. Okay, so let's talk about star breakout for a second. So basically, for those of you who were the last session, I think we talked about this as well, but here I want to get a little bit more specific. First part of your star response is the situation, i.e. the context. So this harkens back to what I said a few slides ago. You want your situation to be 3 to 4 sentences tops, right? Optimized for clarity. If you go into a 5-minute ramble about the things that were going on at work and all the different teams that may or may not have been involved or wanted to be involved but didn't get involved and should have been involved and so on and so forth, I am completely confused by the time you get to the other thing, right? And so it becomes much harder for me to evaluate what you actually did in the context of what you said, right? So keep that really short. Second one is task, right? So what were you tasked with on this project? Again, you want this to be very short, right? I was asked to drive this project to achieve this revenue gain or to implement this feature, boom. right? It could even be one sentence. Like it doesn't have to be long. The key thing is it's super, super clear. The bulk of your response, the vast majority, is going to be the action. Action is I statements. So I found that there was ambiguity in project requirements. So I went and I talked to this project manager, and together we worked on creating the requirements. I talked through the resource allocation for this project and made adjustments and so on. One thing I'm not putting into this slide, and it's don't lie, obviously, but a little bit of embellishment is fine, right? Embellishing what you did slightly or spinning it is okay, right? Like you don't have to come off humble in this part of the response. So like I did this, I did that. If a little bit of details are lost, don't take wholesale credit for somebody else's work, because again, that's not ethical. But generally, it's never quite that black and white. So embellishing what you did a little bit is okay. You want to optimize for specificity, right? So instead of saying I drove the project, like you would say specific things that you did. Like I put in place a system to track deliverables from the sister teams. This was a spreadsheet that we updated on a bi-weekly basis or whatever, right? So you get the idea. Like you're talking about specific things that you did to drive the project forward. The last thing that's really important is, as I mentioned before, the same story can address several different questions. And if you just tell exactly the same story in response to any question, it's not going to be as effective as if you adapt the story more towards the question asked. So for example, let's say you're asked a question about ownership and you had a project with missing requirements, and then later on, like you had an underperforming dev. You can omit the underperforming dev part of the story entirely in your response and really focus in on how you approach the missing requirements and how you got to clarity and how you put the project onto the right execution pathway, right? Or vice versa. Let's say the question is, how have you managed an underperformer? You would take that same story, you would greatly shorten the ambiguity in the requirements. You would just say initially requirements were ambiguous, so I had to dig in and really provide clarity. And then you would say, once we started executing, this developer on my team wasn't keeping up, and so I had to step in, et cetera, right? So you're taking exactly the same story and you're just adapting it towards the question being asked. Practice these in response to different questions. Take the same set of actions and practice adapting them for the different areas that we've listed out. And then finally, result, right? So again, very short, you should optimize for specificity. Right? At the end, the project was delivered on time with no outstanding bugs, and it added like 50 million ARR to the company bottom line. Decreased latency by 30%. The more numbers you can throw into your result, the better. And that's basically the STAR format.
I'll add a little color as usual. Take this very seriously. In particular, pay attention to those optimized points. You won't get a lot of credit for optimizing, but I don't know. The point is this. In an interviewer's success really is a risk. If he says or she says, yes, let's hire this person, that's a big risk. So you're giving them reason not to say no. And by checking those boxes really well, you're actually moving your way through all the no's to a potential yes, and that really helps. And a great way to do that, Eugene already mentioned to rehearse these things or practice these things. I suggest you get serious about that. Go stand in front of a mirror in the bathroom, or make your family sit down and listen to you verbalize your responses to certain questions. So come up with the question yourself and actually have a response in this STAR format about the way that he has prescribed here, and see how it comes across. You'll get good feedback from your friends and family on this. But without rehearsing it, you're doing it cold for your first interview. And you may make mistakes that you'll repeat in the next 7 interviews if it's a long cycle. Instead, try and hammer all those out before you get to that first interview.
Yeah. One of the main issues with rehearsing at interviews is that you don't get feedback, right? Like your feedback will be as a no, but you have no idea why that no came. Right? Was it your delivery? Was it the content? Did you mess up on the technical part, et cetera, et cetera? So at least on this one, you have a chance to get really good specific feedback, and your family or your friends, whoever, don't need to be engineering managers or technical experts to understand the clarity of your story. If they can't understand what you're talking about, there is a really good chance the interviewer won't either. Cool. So that's that. Last thing that I wanted to talk about is what the webinar format will be as soon as we finish this deck, which will be one more slide. So we'll ask you for your most impactful story when you volunteer. Observe the star format as we discussed, right? If we detect meandering situation or task responses, we will interrupt. I'll try to do it gently, but basically the idea is let's keep your responses to 10-minute stops. And Evgeny, maybe you can, like when I have 2 minutes left, maybe you can raise a hand or something, just to indicate that it's going on a bit too long, but let's keep it to 10-minute stops. And then after you've given us the story, we'll provide feedback on the clarity of the response, how well were we able to understand what was said, what areas we think the story might address, and how you can potentially strengthen your response.
This is your chance to rehearse. And you can do that with some pretty professional observation and commentary on how you did. You don't have to be great in this particular webinar. Just give us what you've got, make an attempt at it, and hopefully some feedback will get you to closer to yeses when you actually get down to it.
Also want to add in terms of feedback, guys, you will get the feedback. Please do not defend or oppose to this feedback. It's a feedback, right? You may agree or may not, but consider it is, you just take it, and the rest, how you will handle the feedback, is totally up to you. But you please do not reply back to feedback. Oh no, I'm not agree with the feedback. That's what it is.
And one last thing I'll say is if you hear clicking from my side of the microphone when you're talking, that's me typing and taking notes. By the way, that is the same thing that Amazon interviewers also say when they interview. Okay, so last slide is we are here to help, right? So we are preparing a group interview prep coaching. Sign up. There is a link in the sign up form to the sign up form here. We also offer one-on-one coaching. You can contact us either at the email address below or through my LinkedIn profile or through Ken's LinkedIn profile, or there are also links on the website. So feel free to reach out. We are happy to help out. One thing I will say is I know that there has been a lot of folks laid off in the recent months, and we don't really feel comfortable making people who are laid off pay for this kind of coaching, at least while they don't have a job. So the thing that we would like to propose is if we are coaching you in a one-on-one or this group coaching option, we will send you an invoice once the coaching is completed, but you don't have to worry about it until you get a job. So hopefully that will help with offsetting some of the anxiety that I know people who have been laid off are feeling.
We're all about empathy, and we've been there.
Yeah.
Totally. This is one of the best propositions that I heard. Okay, let's get started. We have one brave candidate to participate in the mock interview, Adriana. I'll move you to the panelist in a sec, and then you can give me 1 second. Yeah, Adriana, please share your resume if you want, or Eugene and Ken will hand over from that part. For the rest people who want to participate in the mock interview, let me know in the webinar chat. Just hit that you want. We have a capacity like maybe 1 or 2 more person to go through the mock interview, but we should be done by 11, and then we're gonna have a Q&A session. All right, Adriana.
Yeah, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Do I need to share my resume? I don't really know how to share it if that's in this platform.
I think actually that's probably not necessary. We can dive straight into the story if you'd like.
Okay, and it's the most impactful story.
Yep. So what we'll do is let's not target it towards any individual area. Just think about the most impactful story you've had and give a generic description of the story. So in other words, the same star format as we discussed, but don't try to adapt it to any specific area. Because then what we'll do is we'll tell you these are the areas that we think this story hits. And then from there, you can then adapt it offline to one area or another area. Does that make sense?
Yes. Is this a good time to ask for I know you just clarified the question for me, but because it's so broad, I'm not really sure it is almost a trick question for me, ask clarifying question at this point. Yeah, is this when you say impactful, are you impactful to my organization or impactful for my career, impactful for my team, or
So I would say impactful to the organization. So using the rubrics that we have discussed before, it's a story that it's either a multi-week, like in other words, like it was a multi-week project, or it involved multiple teams, or it was a project you played or it was a project you played a key role on, or something you're proud of that you got involved in, or something that had a large contribution to the company's bottom line.
wow. Okay, now I'm getting nervous because I don't know if I have a story off the top of my head.
If it helps, I can give you a focusing question.
Maybe that would be good.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
sorry.
let's do that. So can you tell me about a time when you had to go above and beyond to deliver a project that was struggling on time and with high quality?
Yes, that I can do. So back about a couple years ago, my team, actually my organization, a lot of people left because though some companies were hiring like crazy. We had a huge turnover. And so we ended up with just 4 people on a team, and I basically have to wear multiple hats. In addition to being the leader for my team, I also had to be the scrum master, almost a PM, and I even had to do a lot more coding than I was expecting to do myself. And it ended up being, I enjoyed that experience a lot, and I felt like I learned a lot about the process and how to even create a new process for the team to speed things up, because having to wear multiple hats allowed me to have even more empathy for the team and how we can actually speed things up. And there are things that there are meetings that are maybe not necessary. Maybe there are people that don't need to participate in every single meeting. And I felt that was a very good experience for me. And I think it ended up being a very good thing for my team and maybe even the organization, I like to think.
Okay.
Sorry, did I answer the question?
Sorry?
So did I answer the question? I felt like I didn't answer the question. I'm so nervous that I'm like, okay, I already forgot the question.
So let me give a little bit of feedback, and then we can proceed from there.
Yeah.
And Ken, I would also love to hear your thought as well. First of all, in terms of going above and beyond, like you clearly show that you've done it. The issue that I would have with a response like this is it's not really a story, right? So in other words, it's like reading the review of a movie versus watching the movie itself. So so we get like a general overview without any specific story to latch into, right? Because remember, a story follows a star format. So in other words, here was a situation, and your response is actually great for a situation. So this could be the beginning of a story, right? Because then if you were to say, so one time we got this project that came onto our team and had to be executed really quickly. And because I was wearing these multiple hats and I was working with the team, I had to go do X, Y, Z, so on. As a result, the project landed on time and we made an extra 25 mil for the company, right? So that would be a story, right? In other words, your response right now is good for a situational overview, but it doesn't contain a specific incident that you can talk to, right?
Yeah, I would suggest you dig into the stakes. What was at stake? What was at risk? What would have happened if you'd failed? And by actually applying that tension, you can show that you operated in this exceptional way, despite all of the obstacles or the contrary factors that were in play at the time. And that actually is a critical factor in eliciting the empathy of the interviewer and helping them understand just how much you really did contribute to this. So think about the stakes in your response.
The other good thing about this situation and the response here is there is actually a lot for the interviewer to follow up on, right? For example, we could dig into the Scrum Master, Kanban Sensei, I guess is the right terminology these days. So dig into that, and what did that look like, and what specifically did you do, and how did you get your team process on track? We could dig into coding and say which part of the code you really got involved in, right? And this is a great example of how a story can be adapted to the kind of question being asked. So if an interviewer were to ask you a question, can you tell me about a time when you had to make a direct technical contribution to a project your team worked on? You can start with this situational overview. It's great, right? Then you would go into, okay, so there was this one project where I really had to get hands-on because there weren't enough development resources and I had to help out my team, etc., etc., etc. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. Can I ask one question? I think this is the first time I'm doing this. And I think I got really nervous because after you said, okay, only 4 sentences to describe the story. And I think that's when it really threw me off guard a little. I'm not trying to be defensive and I really appreciate the feedback. I think my question is, how do I know? Obviously, I'm not going to bring a stopwatch with me and be like, I'm at 10 minutes, I got to stop. What's a good way to know that my story is too long or like too short, or how do I gauge that? Or is it more of an experience after I do so many interviews?
I would say rehearsal, right?
Yeah.
Like tell the story to a mirror or to your family and actually time it. See how long it takes.
Okay.
Yeah, I would suggest doing it in front of people after you've maybe tried it against the mirror once or twice. And you can glance at the glaze over their eyes and whether or not they've picked up their phones and are looking at their screens is, oh, I think I might have carried on a little bit too long there. So let them be your guide in terms of how you tighten up the pieces, where you would go into detail that are interesting, versus where you're going into detail that you're actually just losing the string with the people who are listening to you. They'll be your best indicators.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I would say too that the action part of the story always tends to be interesting, provided that it's specific enough and it has enough I statements in it, right? So don't be afraid to have that part of the story take 90% of what you talk about, right? The context and task is really just window dressing. It's the thing that we need to understand the action part.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for volunteering. I know it's a brave thing
Yes.
to do in front of a bunch of people, so thank you for that.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Thank you, Adriana. All right, we have a second candidate, Arsalan. You can unmute
Hello.
yourself.
Hi, Arsalan.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So first of all, thank you so much. I have an interview for the area manager role next week. So this was helpful, but you all have gone through the presentation. So the story I want to tell is I will keep my answer around 4 minutes. This is how I've practiced it. So I will spend 30 seconds on situation, 30 seconds on task, and 2 minutes on action, and 30 seconds on result. And then I will also reflect upon it as well. So the situation was back in March 2019, I have received a product quality complaint of a production line where a product has went into the market without the brand label. Yeah. So the marketing director took that faulty product into the office of operations director and told him that this is what you are producing on the line. So the stakes were very high. Number one, it was non-compliance of regulation. Number two, it was directly coming from the marketing director and operation director as well. My task was I was the continuous improvement lead of that production line. I have to resolve that problem and making sure that it does not repeat. I have to root cause what has happened and what went wrong. A couple of actions I have took over that line. So initially for the quarter two, we took multiple small interventions, digging down and going deep and root causing. So the initial root cause was contamination of the machine. So we added additional cleaning, center lines, modified few applications. Yeah. So as a result, we although took dent initially on the efficiency, but we never compromised again on quality. So in order to improve that efficiency bit in quarter 3 2019, we utilize the tool of unified problem solving. So a structured approach that has helped us to further dig down. And as a result of that, in Q4, we bounced back to the initial efficiency we had, and we all resolved not only the quality problem, but also the efficiency problem. So at the end of it, we were back at 50% efficiency. We were at 33, and we 24 faults per day to 8 faults per day, the quality faults I'm talking about. So when I reflect upon this specific situation, so it taught me problem solving, it taught me leading a complex problem, and it taught me collaborating with your technical team and with your other coworkers. So yeah, that's about it.
Okay, great. I don't know, Ken, do you want to go first and I can go second, or how would you prefer? I do have some feedback, but I can wait.
Why don't you go ahead? I like the color position.
Sounds good. So this is first of all, again, thank you for volunteering, and I really like the way that you structured the response. It clearly follows STAR. There are a few small things that I think could be cleaned up, and I'll just run through them. So first, the thing, and this may not be quite as big of an issue when you're interviewing at a company that is doing something adjacent to what you've done before, but maybe this is more of an issue in this kind of a format. But the thing is, I have no context at all about what your company makes. Is it apps? Is it Coca-Cola bottles? Is it airplanes? And so because of that, like trying to understand the context, like when you're saying product went out without branding, I'm not sure what that means. So one thing that could be worth starting a situation with is in 2019, I worked for Acme Co, and we created mobile phone apps that targeted this particular scenario. As we were creating it, we realized that these apps were going out without branding or whatever. As I dug into the problem initially, I realized, et cetera, right? So basically providing this 50,000-foot overview of the context, just so that the interviewer has something specific to latch onto, could be helpful, right? The task section, I think, was really clear. So great job there. On the action section, what I've heard was mostly we statements. So we took multiple small interventions. We did this, we did that. As soon as you say we, I now have no idea what you actually did, right? Like we could have been like you sitting in the corner and the rest of the team doing all the work, or we could have been you were being humble and you did all the work and the rest of the team did nothing, and you just don't want to self-aggrandize. I don't know, right? So it's much better to use I statements, right? So avoid the word we entirely in your response. If it really was a we, then you could say I and 2 key members of my team, or I and the product manager, I and whoever else went and did this and that, right? But always start with an I statement, right? So I did this in combination with some other person, so on. And then on the results side, I think maybe crisping it up a little bit more could be useful. Again, this is a chance to talk about numbers. And actually, like going back to Ken's previous point around starting a story with stakes, like we talked about the product, or you talked about the product going out without branding. What does that mean? Does that mean you were losing revenue? Does that mean customers were unhappy? What does customer unhappiness look like? Like we were getting like 30 tickets a day to our support call center about this issue or whatever, right? That is also a good place. Like when you're talking about stakes, that's also a great place to throw in some numbers. And then at the very end, when you talk about result, you can reference back to those numbers, right? Like our support calls dropped to half like a call once a week or something, or we made an extra $10 million or whatever it is, right? So you really want to crisp up that result response, because this is essentially where you're hitting the interviewer over the head with how awesome you are, right? Like you did this, right? Like I can connect to you made $10 million for your company. Like I want that person, right? I can connect to you reduced the customer support calls by 90%. Like I want that person, because my company also has customer support calls. I can't as much connect to branding or no branding, because like in my case, like I'm an engineering manager on the back end. What do I know of branding? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Very solid feedback.
Okay, so a little color. My feedback is along the same lines. You did mention the stakes, that it was essentially demanded by executive level people in the organization, but I really wanted to understand, what did that mean to the business? I mean, were you going to lose customers? It's a big deal not to be in compliance. And of course, that means you probably have to recall everything if we're talking about something that's physical. But I would love to understand that a little bit more, and how you were setting up the situation. Because at the end, I also want to hook it back to that particular thing, which is something that Eugene referenced as well. But I'll zoom in a little bit. What I mean is, we, as managers, we understand efficiency as just simply a factor. It's not a goal in and of itself, and yet it seemed to be your goal. So if your goal was efficiency, how did that become your goal? Did someone tell you had to actually improve efficiency to a certain percentage point? That goal would have actually been backed up by something like, we need to gain 1,500 more customers by the end of April. And efficiency is one of the various things that play into it. Quality is another one of those things. And the cost of running the business is another one of those things. So these are all levers that you pull as a manager, and you do it in variance with whatever is truly necessary in the moment. So tying that situation toward the actual resolution that you seek, and then actually completing that circle, so we understand the whole cycle. You were asked to do this, your goal was this. This thing here was a part of how you achieved it, and when you got to the finish line, all of that stuff lined up so you could meet this original goal. That's the kind of story circle we're looking for when we're interviewing.
Thank you so much, Ken. Really appreciate that. I got what you're saying.
Great, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Arsan.
Arsan.
Good luck.
Good luck. Yep.
All right, that was quick. We have Soundarya, if I'm
Yeah.
pronounced correctly.
You did.
Hi, Sundari. Thank you for volunteering.
Thank you. Thanks for giving me this chance to understand how this process would be.
Happy to. So would you like a focusing question, or do you want to launch straight into a story?
I would like to answer the same question, the impactful task which I have done. Yeah. So I work for a company called Intelligrated, where we develop a product called Warehouse Execution System, which automates the various warehouse activities. So the software what we write should hit the hardware, where we try to pick and deliver the inventory to the user. So the software what we developed was functioning very well, and we didn't had much of an issue on the software end. But the issue came where software is running along with the hardware, the latency issues popped up. So my management had asked me to take this on priority and decrease the latency issues, because the amount of impact that we have to support on the floor of the warehouse is much more. So I took this as a challenge, and I came up with an idea to have a small setup in our main office, where hardware would be installed, not full functional end to end, but base main features are tested with the software and the hardware together, so that we can get that confidence when we actually deliver the software. That proposal was taken by my management, and they had helped me to recruit a couple of QAs and a couple of support people to get this done. But it had a good amount of investment, because we had to get the hardware too, to just for the testing purpose, to be running the software. So it was there was a little bit pushback, but I was able to convince them the results that we would get it. So everything went fine, with people going to our main office to test it and to decrease the latency issues, how they are causing, what to make the optimization. So eventually, once the product was done, tested along with this whole volume testing and everything, now the latency issues what we have earlier faced had decreased almost to 1%. And my management was like really happy with the numbers that we have seen in the metrics level, the KPIs which we are hitting, and we are able to ship the software to our customers with much more confidence, and then we are able to get more orders.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. There's a ton of really good material here in the story. So first of all, the situation was crystal clear. Thank you for that. You can see, I hope from Sundaria's response, how a very clear situation statement makes the rest of the response so much easier to understand, so much easier to latch onto. So great job on the situation. On the task, I think overall it was perfectly fine. One thing that I would suggest from my point of view is having a number. For example, instead of saying decrease latency issue, like you could say our latency was 600 milliseconds and our NFR, non-functional requirement, was like 200 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. Throw a number in there. In an engineering manager interviews, numbers help, right?
Okay.
So whenever possible, go more specific. Then on the action, so the idea was great, and the way that you articulated the idea that you had, proposal was accepted. Here, you may consider talking briefly about how you went about getting that proposal to be accepted. For example, I organized a meeting with the engineering leadership and I presented to them, I made this PowerPoint deck or whatever, or wrote up this proposal that kind of show the ROI on buying a system like this, etc. You can spend a couple sentences maybe talking about specifically what you did. But the other thing is, in your response, you said the management helped you recruit a couple support people. This is actually where an I statement and maybe some degree of embellishment might not be a bad idea. I would just say, I recruited a couple support people. Maybe you could say I recruited a couple support people with the help of management, but don't put the focus on the management, put the focus on what you did. Next thing is, you said you had to also get hardware, you got some pushback, but you were able to convince them. This is a great place to expand. Like that one bullet point, I would expand into 2 minutes. In other words, what did you do to convince them? What techniques did you use? There are various techniques for convincing people, like Microsoft, for example, is called lining up the ducks, which is, you know who you want to convince, you know who they listen to, you try to convince those people. If you can't, you try to convince the people that those people listen to, and so on and so forth, right? The point is, what technique did you use and how long did it take? Was it a simple meeting? Was it a series of meetings that you set up? Did you bring in additional allies to help support your case? This is probably going to be the bulk of your answer, actually, because this is where what you did had the most impact. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
And then I would also maybe spend a little bit more time on the actual, once you got this hardware testing, right? Was there a point at which your involvement basically stopped entirely, or were you actually working also with the rest of the team to work on this latency decrease?
Okay.
If you continued working with them, I would definitely talk about that, right?
Okay.
So this was a 2-month project or whatever, 3-week project. Because we had the testing rig on site, we were able to quickly validate our changes and see what impact our changes were making. And because of that, that accelerated delivery speed of that project by estimated, whatever, 80%, 90%. And then finally, latency decreased by 80%. Awesome. I would again reference back to the NFR, right? So you were aiming for this latency goal and you managed to hit it, you managed to exceed it, etc. But those are all small nits. Like overall, I think the story is great.
Thank you. One quick question. So for every star related or any question, not every time I would have the financial numbers to put in the results, right? How would I know the dollar value or the stake impact that had went in so that I can put it in a number and then you talk to them?
It's a good question. There are going
That's
to be
fair.
times where you legitimately don't know and can't get it at all. And then maybe going after some different metrics would be worthwhile, like you reduced number of customer support calls or whatever. But you can also, and can like jump in if you disagree. This is me going out on a little bit of a limb. I think you can also fudge it a little. In other words, if the company's total ARR, and that can be found out publicly. If you know how much money approximately this product line is generating, you can guesstimate how much money this product line is generating, right? And then based on that, if you know how impactful this latency issue was, like for example, if you were getting 30% of your customers were unhappy, you just increased your revenue by 30% of that product line's revenue, right? It's a gross oversimplification, obviously. But the thing is, I, as an interviewer, am not going to contact your boss in your company and say, hey, did that really make $1.253 million? Or was it actually like 2.05?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Thanks,
keep in mind
guys.
the
Yeah.
difference between
Mm.
embellishing and really just laying out a whopper. Just be careful that your
Yeah.
embellishment stays very modest. And
Mm.
and I was going to focus also on the results. You mentioned that there was an 80% improvement, but like Eugene said, I actually want to know what that means, because that 80% could be great, could be terrible. It doesn't matter that it was 80%. What matters is what was the measurements that you were using. You also mentioned KPIs, but not until the very end, that you were help the company make a KPI. I'd want to know about that at the beginning so I can tie it all together. And that KPI actually has a lot to do with customer satisfaction. I wanted a number to understand at the end of it. You had more customers, how many? And do you have an estimate? And in reaction to your last question, I've learned that the hard way. And what I end up doing is at the end of it, there's some retro, there's some meeting, I'll ask the people there, or I'll ask accounting, or I'll ask a leader, what do you think was the impact of this resolution? Just how would I measure this so that we can all talk about this as having had an impact, whether it's negative or positive, frankly. And then you actually have it. You can use that internally. You can use that to your advantage internally, and you can also use it in future interviews. But don't let these moments that you're proud of just wander by without taking a moment to try and get the measurements out of them. So those are my inputs.
Sure. Thanks, guys, for all this detailed feedback. That's really helpful.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you again for volunteering.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was awesome. Do we have capacity for the last person, Shah?
Yeah.
And we can wrap it up. All right. Hello, Shah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Sean.
Hey, how you
Hi.
doing?
Good. Thank you for volunteering.
No problem. I figured I'd jump into the lion's den.
So would you like a focusing question, or do you want to get straight into the story?
Yeah, we could start with a focusing. No, you know what? I'm not going to get a focusing question probably in a real interview. I'll probably get a more generic one. So yeah, I guess lay it on me how it would be in a regular interview, and I'll see how I handle it.
Sure. So let's try. Tell me about a time when you had a disagreement with your team or a partner team or your manager on a super important project, and how did you approach that?
Okay, a disagreement with a team. Yes. Okay. I worked on a project called, formerly worked at Yahoo, and we had a product called Experience Platform. And what the Experience Platform did is it's basically what's in charge of what you receive as a viewer for any given Yahoo property. If I'm on Yahoo Finance, Yahoo Sports, the layout and the content I get is determined by the Experience Platform. And I was in charge. I was tasked with being a product manager for a new product called Experience Creator. And I had a vision for how we can redesign. It wasn't being adopted. So the problem was it was not being adopted by Yahoo at large. We wanted it to. And the threat was that if not enough people were going to utilize our platform, we were in danger of getting defunded, ousted, and thrown to the nether regions of Yahoo. I was tasked with creating a product that turned a very difficult and complicated developer-focused process of creating an experience for Experience Platform into something that non-engineers and people who are the masters of their various verticals like Yahoo, Sports, Finance, and these were all non-engineering people, to get them to adopt and understand the power that we offer. And there were several executive stakeholders and people who did not understand the process or disagreed with the process. So basically what I did was I created a lot of visual graphic maps to illustrate what our mission, what our values were, and how they aligned with Yahoo's overall mission and values, and broke out all of our feature sets that we're going to redo the functionality, basically abstract all of these features to make them accessible to Yahoo as a whole, how that was going to impact and how that was going to feed into not only our vision for Experience Platform, but Yahoo's vision and mission statement as a whole. And so this entailed so Yahoo's vision is to connect users and people with their passions. And so basically I laid out every feature set that I was going to basically make accessible to every Yahoo stakeholder, how each one of those absolutely directly connects people with their passions. So with Experience Creator, I created this complete digital overhaul with WYSIWYG editor for everything, super intuitive. And it allows us to respond to breaking news in seconds rather than in days or weeks, which was taken before. It was allowing people to have users to have dynamically generated content, dynamic layouts in a way that resonates with them. We take contextual data about things that we know about the user, whether or not they're a subscriber to a given Yahoo property, what time zone they're in, geographical location, and it would change the layout to present what is most relevant to them, and democratizing the feature set that we had on our platform and allowing the people who know their audience the best to have access to this feature-rich, powerful set was going to absolutely connect users with their passions by every metric possible. And I built out a prototype. Not only did I make the illustrated charts and graphs and presentations, I made a very interactive, intuitive prototype in Figma to show how that would go about. I went and interviewed over 50 people in the company and validated my prototypes, got their feedback, got their impact, what impact that would have on their day-to-day workflow. Would you use this tool? Would it affect how you reach your users? And got unanimous consensus that it absolutely would. And so by the time I made my ultimate presentation to the executive stakeholders, it was a no-brainer. They absolutely let go of any disagreements they might have had with putting our investment into our project. And we got it done. We quoted, it was supposed to be about 8 months. I got so much feedback and so much buy-in, and people were so ecstatic about it. They got it done in 4 months, the MVP. And then we went from maybe one team potentially adopting it to 6 verticals adopting it on day one.
Awesome. Let's see, I'm just catching up on notes. Okay. One quick question. So are you interviewing for this story as an engineering manager or as a program manager or as an IC? Or as
okay, in my job, I was a technical manager, but I wore a million hats. We were very, like underfunded. I wore all the hats. I made like Adobe After Effects motion graphic videos and stuff to present things, and I was doing the prototyping because we didn't have an official like UI UX designer on our team. So I did all the things. I helped build out some of the software architecture to make sure that it played well with like our AI recommendations team and in other areas. So I did a bit of everything in that role. So it's tough to define what I was.
But your official title, was it EM or something else?
It was just senior product manager.
Got it. Okay. Okay. And when you're thinking about using this story, are you thinking about using it for an EM interview or for a product manager or manager of PM?
Product manager, more specifically. I don't have a solid set of engineering. Well, I guess I do have a couple of engineering manager star stories, but yeah, I do need to architect them better for engineering manager.
No, that's totally fine. I'm just trying to understand the context because that will inform a little bit of the feedback that I'll have. So again, overall, awesome story, super clear situation. Great job there. It may be, so one question that I had, you mentioned that the Experience Platform was in danger of obsolescence. And the question that I intuitively ask is, should it have been maybe? Like, what would happen if it was obsoleted? Was there something better on the horizon that may have replaced it? In other words, if the statement of this team or this platform was in danger of obsolescence is strictly coming from a perspective of I'm on this team and I don't want it to be obsoleted, that's not enough of customer obsession, right? So in the situation description, I think what you might consider doing is putting the onus back on the customer. So I was worried that this platform was going to be obsoleted, and as a result, the customers would not have as delightful an experience because their layouts would be more static. There was nothing else to replace the experience platform in the pipeline. So overall, the engagement with the content would drop. So that kind of thing. So really put the focus on what customer impact would that have. This is especially important, like customer obsession is especially important for program managers, obviously, right? Because that's what you guys are most closely connected to. Like you're the voice of the
By
customer,
program.
essentially. Sorry?
By program, he means product.
Yeah, sorry.
He often uses
Product
the
manager.
word, yeah.
PM. Yes. So basically, like really underscoring customer obsession, I think would be really useful. The task was pretty clear. So I felt like I understood. The action, it's great that you're tying this back into the vision. And that's, again, like a place where PM, like having a good grasp of the organizational vision and their team vision is a really good green flag. So yeah, I think that was great. One thing that, and this is why I was asking you whether this was more directed at engineering manager roles or whether more an IC role, a lot of the action items that you described were things that you directly did. And that's great, right? We talked about I statements and how important that is. For a manager position, you would want some stories that show your impact through others, how you scaled your impact by leveraging others' work. The equivalent of this story might have been like, I worked with my development team to develop this prototype of the WYSIWYG editor, and we built it in whatever number of days, weeks, or whatever, and then we're able to demo that. In other words, your impact through others. For this story, if you're just like, if you're going for an IC position, the story works great. Actually, the story would work great for a EM role too, or a manager role too. You would just want to prefix it with, okay, here's an example of where I really had to get hands-on and deliver stuff on my own. So I think that was good. The result was great. You talked about MVP being done in 4 months and 6 verticals adopting. So you're throwing numbers, that's great. If you can, in the beginning of the situation, talk about customer engagement numbers. For example, you could talk about session time or scroll depth or pages viewed per session or those standard metrics. And then you can talk about how those were impacted once those 6 verticals adopted the system. That would make the message maybe even a little bit stronger. Like we increase session time by 30% or whatever.
Let me add that for a product manager, the fact that you went out and interviewed 50 people is normal. It's good. My presumption is that these people were actually internals. What a product manager leader is going to be looking for is, okay, how did you engage your actual customers in this argument? How do you know that they really wanted this capability? Because that's what leadership is going to fight back on. It's, we want to obsolete this because customers hate it. Oh, that's actually a different matter. Like Eugene said, the stakes were unclear in that sense. It's okay, we knew you'd be relegated to probably an unhappy role. But what is the impact of customers if this were happening? Would they cheer or would they actually be crying? And that's what you can use at the end to say, yeah, I interviewed 50 insiders and we did surveys with over 10,000 customers. And what we found was that there was overwhelming support for these to be incorporated into additional verticals. That would have tied this whole thing together. A very good presentation where they would have tied it all together in a way that just made it into a true winner.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah, I appreciate that.
All right. I think, yeah, thank you, Shar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
This is
Thank you.
priceless feedback. One thing I would say, I guess maybe I should look at the time when I start talking. I try to really make it concise. And I think I might have suffered in some of those critical details that you spoke of in my effort to be concise. I wonder if there's a framework with which I guess you said if their eyes are glossing over, aren't glossing over, I'm still doing okay. So maybe I should have embellished a little more, but this insight has been priceless. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.
Happy
Thank you,
to.
Shah. Thank
And
you,
thanks
Gene.
again for volunteering.
Right,
You
I
know,
think
Just a quick word about the timing. Keep in mind that these are guidelines. If it's a really cool story, I've had interviews both as an interviewer and an interviewee where the story is fascinating, and that's all you talk about for the whole hour. And it's really fun when these things actually take over. So make sure there's opportunities to do that. Don't try and fit everything into tiny little boxes, but treat these timings as guidelines. And if nothing else happens, your guidelines have led toward a yes. And that's really what your goal is. If you have one of those moments where everything gets sidetracked into a great detail level exploration of your story, be glad, because that's a great moment. You've got somebody caught up in the situation.
I would, by the way, make a quick recommendation. It's interesting that the stories that people tell in interview settings are actually not all that dissimilar from stories that we as human beings naturally gravitate to. Like, there's stories, right? And they either have conflict and tension and arouse our interest and all of that, or they don't. So one book that's worth reading that might help you with how to tell stories effectively, it's called Storyworthy. And it's written by a guy who won 34 Grand Slam Moth championships. Moth is like the public storytelling forum. Some really good insight there on how to tell compelling stories. And a lot of that insight can be used for interviewing. So take a look at that book.
send us a link.
Yep, I can do that.
That would be awesome. I am interested for myself. Anyway, yeah, very well said. There is a question in the chat. How to approach the interview if there's no managerial experience? For example, for senior developer to a manager role.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Ken, do you want to take this first, or I have some thoughts either way?
Go ahead. I like commenting on your comments.
All right. Hopefully, if you're interviewing for an EM role, you have had some experience with leadership. So you may not have had experience with direct people management, doing performance reviews and like all of that stuff. But as a technical lead, like, you probably have led some projects where you had to get other engineers to contribute and help you. Or one other common way of entering engineering management is through managing interns or supervising interns. So if you've had an experience like that, I would say that if you have had no leadership experience whatsoever and haven't managed interns or been responsible for the output of somebody else, unless the company is really desperate for an engineering manager, which in today's climate, that's unlikely, it's going to be hard.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a lot easier to work your way into a manager role within a company that already believes in you than to convince somebody who has never seen you or heard of you before and is also looking at 500 people with a great amount of experience compared to you. You're not going to convince them. That's going to be a very hard sell, very low probability. Let me say it that way. Focus on your career ladder at your current work, wherever that might be, and see if you can actually arrange to have some exposure to managerial tasks, even if it's not a promotion to engineering manager or product manager. You can be a leader in a number of different ways, like Eugene mentioned.
Yeah. Sometimes also, like, an EM will go on a leave of absence or a long vacation and will say, okay, you're my backup person. If something comes up, like, you're the person to handle it. That's a great thing to reference, right? And hopefully you will have stories from that time. They may not be as big stories, but still, there should be some stories from that.
All right. I think we can wrap it up if there is no any other questions. Guys, hit us a plus sign if it was useful for you. You learned something today, and I appreciate that. Like, almost everyone stick to the end. It's very interesting. Arsalan has a question. It's up to you, Arsalan, if you have a question.
Yeah, I have put that in the chat box in the QA. If you can see and just quickly response.
Ah,
respond to that?
Oh, yeah, there's QA.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, all right, no problem. So my question is, can we use PowerPoint presentation to tell our career story? For example, one slide, two slide to tell the background and to connect things. Given that we have video interviews nowadays everywhere, I have seen someone doing this and it was very effective.
I don't know. My opinion might be a little bit apocryphal here, but here's the thing. Like, what I'm trying to do in an interview when I'm interviewing a candidate is I'm trying to knock them off their pre-recorded and pre-rehearsed and pre-made spiel, right? Because I'm going for signal amplitude means a candidate is not simply reading off something that they've prepared before, but they're having to think, they're having to adapt their response to what I need. And that's how I get to see how they think and how they approach situations, right? If somebody has a pre-made spiel, like, yes, it'll come up, it'll probably give the information in a more polished way. But I also know that everybody spins, and that's okay. We're human beings, we all spin, right? I'll know that what you're presenting through that PowerPoint presentation is the most polished, most beautiful way of presenting your career you could think of, right? And that's a low amplitude signal. That's my thought.
Yeah, I view the interview as
I
an
got that.
opportunity to see a person in their element, as if you were actually in a technical meeting with your team, you were in an extended stand-up, you're in a retro. What are your thoughts? What are your reactions? How are you driving the conversation to something that's truly meaningful? How are you inspiring people? How are you bringing them back into the fold when they start rambling into subtasks or subcategories of conversation? That's far more valuable to me as a hiring manager than to know that you've created a PowerPoint. In fact, I tend to actually move away from PowerPoints as a way to understand somebody. They're very much, they're very much great. And I don't want that at all. I want to know who you are.
Now, the one thing I would say is it does depend on the experience of the interviewer, right? So if the interviewer is less experienced and is not as well versed in behavioral interviews, or maybe not as prepared, for example, they haven't read your resume beforehand, they haven't come with a specific set of questions or things to drill into, that could work in the sense that you're making them less nervous and their decision a little bit easier. So I guess what you might consider is if you have, like, when you're interviewing with a hiring manager and you know that this person has a ton of experience, this may not be a good way to go. When you're interviewing with a junior program manager or like a program manager or a SDE2 or something, right? That might actually work, right? It could serve as a conversational icebreaker. So in a way, you're almost controlling the interview, which some interviewers will let you do. I actually just recently had an interview for a TPM role on my team. And when I came in, so this is technical program manager. When I came in, she said, hey, Eugene, why don't you do this? You'll do introductions, like I'll introduce myself, then you tell me briefly about yourself, and then you can ask me some questions, and then I have some questions of my own. In other words, she took control of the interview from the first 5 seconds. And if this was a junior developer who did that, I might push back, right? Because there are specific things I want to know. But for a technical PM, that is her job, taking control of running meetings efficiently, right? So she's showing me that she can do her job in the interview itself. So that was actually very effective, right? So basically what I'm saying is adopt your interviewing style to the role and the seniority of the interviewer.
totally, totally.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I never ever thought on these lines, looking to the perspective from the interview, like how you think and how you perceive. It really gave me good insights. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Yeah.
Good.
Pleasure.
You're very welcome. All right, folks, we gotta wrap it up. I think today's session was very insightful. At least for me, it was so insightful. I took a lot of notes for myself, and thank you very much, Eugene and Ken, for giving the feedback and providing this framework. And guys, again, like if any of you want to have one-on-one session with Ken or Eugene, add them to the LinkedIn or you can email them. Otherwise, you also can sign up for our group coaching sessions that will inform you shortly when we're going to start. But this is the format, very short and brief format, how it's going to be. Yeah. And thank you very much. If you are more interested in our mock interviews, follow our meetup groups, follow us on LinkedIn, and I'll see you next session then. All right.
Sounds good. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ken.
you.
Thank you, Eugene, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Evgeny, thank you for running it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.